Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first of our topics series for this course. Now, a couple of little housekeeping things on how this is going to work, and then we'll pass over to Glenn in a second. So, the way that this works is basically, I hope you have all been looking at the literature, exploring this question and trying to understand a little bit more about the sorts of evidence that go into making decisions about bike helmet laws. What we're going to do now is turn to asking questions of an expert. Now, I'll introduce Glenn in a second, and Glenn will do a little bit of intro for himself as well in a second. What we're going to do is to try and make this as equitable as possible. I have written down everyone's name who submitted a question to Turnitin and put it in here in my helmet of randomization, and I'll pull names out of a hat at random and then we'll go from there. Basically, we probably or guaranteed will not get through everyone's question in this time. It depends how loquacious Glenn is, but even so, even if it's one-word answers, we won't get through everyone's questions. So we will try to be as random as possible. However, if we get towards the end and you have burning questions, then I might turn to there. If you have a question that is different to everyone else's, then that's fine. First thing, I've just grabbed names from the Turnitin list here. If you want to ask a question, but you haven't put your question in the Turnitin link yet, could you put your name in the chat or something like that, and then I can write your name and add it to there. Thank you, Glenn, for putting a helmet on. That's perfect. I guess I could put a helmet on too.
Underneath here.
Second thing, I'll pull out people's names, and I'd love if you were able to ask the question if you are here in class. So if you're here in class, dive in and ask the question. If you're not in class, of course, you don't have to. I will go into your Turnitin link and I will ask the question myself. There'll be a little bit of jumping around there. I'll try and give a little bit of warning. So I'll ask two people at once to go, just so the person after knows. Beyond that, I think we might be almost ready to go. Does anyone have any questions on the question asking format before we start in? Fantastic. Well, Glenn, you've taken off your helmet for a second now. You don't have to do this in bike helmet. Maybe I will later. I don't know. But I'd like to welcome Glenn Fuller. So as you will have read on the bio that we linked up in Wattle before, Glenn Fuller is from the University of Canberra. And he has done research in a variety of different places. He's head of School of Arts and Communication. He is currently doing some work on various aspects of cycling. So Glenn, if you just want to say hello to the class and maybe talk for 2 or 3 minutes just on your background and how you got into doing work now on cycling, and then we'll dive into the questions.
Cool. Hi everyone. Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep. So my background is mostly looking at, originally my PhD was on car culture, enthusiast car culture, and a fair bit of that was to do with the kind of sociology of mobility, I guess. And then that interest translated into looking at cycling and cycling culture. So there's been a fair bit of research out of the UK on cycling culture, not much in Australia. Most of the research on cycling has come from a kind of public health type framing or a road safety type framing. So with some other researchers, 2 from the University of Wollongong and 1 from the University of Sydney, we got a big grant from the ARC to investigate cycling culture in Sydney in particular, to think through questions around how kind of decisions are made. So our big focus was on policy. So cycling culture and its intersection with policy. So how are decisions made around different investments in cycling in Sydney, where it's a bit of a mess, to put it in a straightforward way. Lots of issues to do with transport, and cycling itself is a really kind of interesting problem because kind of investment in cycling infrastructure cuts across all 3 levels of government that we have in Australia, so federal, state and local. So often it's the local councils who are doing cycling infrastructure type investment using state budgets that's often directed by a national cycling strategy. So it's this really complex intersection of different kind of policy levels. And so that's not actually my area of expertise. So Tess Lee, who's at the University of Sydney, she does an anthropology of policy. Her background is looking at kind of Indigenous cultures, and she's translated that to looking at the ways in which various decisions have been made to do with cycling. From University of Wollongong, there's Gordon Waite. He's actually head of school at Wollongong. He does kind of cultural geography. So he has looked at other transport questions previously, mostly to do with driving and issues around convenience. So he did this fantastic project with a student around sweat. How do people think about sweat when they're commuting? Because some people don't like getting sweaty. Other people don't care. If you're an academic, no one really cares.
I have never seen an academic project on how people think about sweat, but of course, there should be more.
So my interest in all this is to do with enthusiasts. So my PhD work was on car enthusiasts, part of which was the history of summer nats. So for people who are local, ever wanted to know about summer nats, you can ask me questions about that. But that translated to thinking about cycling enthusiasts. So we know that there's relatively high rates of kind of participation amongst recreational cyclists. And it seems like one of the low-hanging fruits from a policy point of view would be to convert recreational cyclists into kind of commuting cyclists. So that seems really difficult. That doesn't seem to happen much. So we sort of wanted to investigate that a bit. The other dimension of it was thinking from a policy framework, like what are the barriers? Because there's been a huge amount of research done on cycling and how it basically addresses a whole range of issues: public health, the environment, questions of well-being. So all these massive ticks are arranged in a list, and yet in Australia, in Sydney in particular, but pretty much every other capital city, urban area around Australia, it's actually really hard to get a positive response from kind of across the board to do with cycling infrastructure and in investment in cycling. So my actual research so far has been looking at media reports, because I'm a media scholar. That's how I'm kind of placed here at UC. Media reports, not only about cycling identity, for which there's been a bit of research to do with media and kind of representations of cyclists, but also cycling infrastructure. So how do we report on cycling infrastructure? And what's happened just recently, and this is the last point I'll make, and I'll hand back over to Will, is the pandemic shutdown, the COVID shutdown, has been a bit of a natural experiment, because not unlike what happened around 9/11, when all the planes stopped flying and they could finally measure what the kind of pollution was in the atmosphere when there weren't planes, we could see what happened when there was a massive downturn in traffic. And we're currently in the midst of going through data from a massive kind of nationwide survey with a couple of industry partners from Trek and some the City of Sydney transport people put out through their channels too, this survey looking at people's habits and how they shifted because of the pandemic shutdown. So there's that. We're also doing interviews, huge response. We had about 60 people respond to our prior, our kind of interviews we did last year, which was part of the project in Sydney, looking at the kind of language bike, what are the barriers to people cycling. And now we've done a sequel to that, which is the kind of reactivated bike, people who have got back on their bikes and the things that they had to overcome to start riding again because of this kind of pandemic part of the thing. So it's an ongoing project. There's another two years to go on at the actual big project. We should have some findings from our survey pretty soon. I'm aiming to present those later in the year. I'm not too sure how long the interviews will take, because there's been quite a number of responses to that, double the number of responses to the pre-COVID interviews. So yeah, that's kind of state of play for me.
Awesome. Okay, that's great, Glenn. Well, I was going to say Joshua Robertson, you're first, and then Sue Brumby after that. But I quickly want to know just a tiny bit more about people's attitudes to sweat. Well, I actually don't want to know about that, because I know people's attitudes to sweat. Fair enough. Is that something that can be taken seriously in a policy landscape?
So the way that translates into a policy landscape, and we actually see evidence of this in some of the comments back from people who have started cycling during the COVID kind of constraints is in terms of kind of end of trip facilities. So people ride to work and they want to be able to get changed and, get into work mode, their work clothes. Like I was only half joking when I said academics don't care. It's because like whatever, we don't necessarily have a uniform we have to wear. So people who wear suits or in business, like some kind of commercial activity, they do want to get changed. They do need to, kind of comport themselves in a way which is appropriate for an office. And we've seen with various reports that people aren't able, even though they want to, they're not actually able to cycle into work at the moment because they've shut down all the end of trip facilities because it's too much of a health risk.
Oh my God! Of course,
there isn't an investment in cleaning them, so they can't use them, and they can't actually guarantee that they'll be clean enough, all the surfaces and whatever, to make sure there's not going to be some COVID-19, whatever kind of coronavirus breakout. So it's really interesting that again, it's still a barrier. It's not so much the sweat in itself. It's kind of what the sweat signifies if you don't kind of clean up and kind of present yourself for whatever workplace you're in. So yeah, so it's still an ongoing issue. For those who can get away with being a bit sweaty, then great. But for a lot of people who work in white collar jobs, that's not appropriate.
Cool, awesome. Joshua, would you like to dive in and ask your question, or I can grab it from Turnitin if you prefer? But...
yeah, I can ask. Thanks for coming in, Glenn. I was doing some research into the topic. I found some things on the bike helmet standard in Australia, and I found some people were saying that it's not really a good enough standard because it doesn't actually test realistic crash scenarios. It only tests someone falling off the bike when it's stationary, not at speed or into a fast moving car or something like that. So I was just wondering whether you think the Australian bike helmet standard is not actually strict enough to ensure the safety of the rider, given that it maybe doesn't test those more realistic crash scenarios.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with the kind of design standards. I am kind of familiar with the process though. The other thing that's, I think, worth thinking about is the way in which the actual technology behind bike helmets has kind of continued improving. And I think industry is actually working at a faster rate, to be honest, than the standards ask for. So, which is the point I want to make, is that I'm not sure how much the standards kind of apply. Kind of absolutely, it's a really interesting kind of state of affairs, because there is a global kind of cycling industry, right? And so, if you're into bikes and you there'll be a point where you start building your own bikes and you realize you can buy parts cheaper online from overseas. And so you do, including helmets, which you can't wear in Australia, and you certainly can't wear them when you take part in, sanctioned events, because they check to make sure that you've got the little kind of Australian standard sticker on the helmet. And you may have a more recent helmet that has more advanced kind of technology. So here I'm thinking about the, what's it called, MIPS. It's like a little plastic sheet that basically allows the helmet to rotate on your head if you have an impact, because there's a lot of kind of rotational force involved in actual impacts, which is I think what the research indicates, and which is not checked for in our standards. So yeah, it is an interesting problem. There's lots of things that I think you could probably point to and say, look, the regulations aren't really, working at the pointy end, but at a bare minimum, you think about, where everyone buys their helmets from. Most people aren't buying them from local bike shops. They're not buying, the latest and greatest helmet. They're buying the bare minimum because they're tasked with wearing a helmet. And so they go to Kmart and buy a helmet, and, Kmart buys their bikes and their helmets at bulk, probably from third-party people that source them from overseas. And it's probably a really good thing we have standards in those circumstances to make sure that whatever minimal safety benefit a helmet serves when you're riding around kind of recreationally with your kids and family and stuff, that it actually does something which is built into the standards. But yeah, it's a knotty problem, because I think industry's way in advance. Like at the moment, there's a bit of a disjunct, because yeah, the latest and greatest helmets you can buy probably work better than the standards demand.
That's a great point. I think I'd love to pull out more on that later on in the conversation. Let's keep going with more conversations. More questions, sorry. Sue Brumby and then Alison Tilby.
Thanks. Good morning, Glenn. During our course, we've been discussing a lot around behaviour change theories and models, including self-efficacy, peer pressure, peer views. perceived benefits, supportive environments, and readiness to change, mandatory helmet laws appear to be blamed for decreased participation and increased fear. What are the key factors to increase participation, and are mandatory helmet laws really a barrier or an enabler?
What are the barriers? That's a great question. If you can answer that, you can take over my research project. Yeah, it's interesting. Look, it's one variable. Like you look at all the data and the curves, and of course there's a downturn in kind of cycling kind of participation at the time in the early 90s, and in particular certain segments. So like a key area look at where there's been a big downturn, which is a bit troubling, which is for young women in particular. So kind of teenage women, there seems to be a sharp downturn in the rate of participation, and that is often associated with the introduction of kind of mandatory helmet laws. I'm not super convinced, because it seems to be one variable out of many. Like I would really like to see, to be convinced, some more kind of qualitative data around what is going on with young women in particular. So for those segments, so there's the kind of population-wide effects where it looks like you can paint a picture, right, with certain things that have happened, certain kind of historical events, which could be true, but that to me isn't a slam dunk argument. That to me indicates that you really need to do more research to figure out what's going on there. The other dimension of it is, it may certainly have been true for the generation of young women that were young women at the time that the mandatory helmet laws were introduced, but I'm not sure what's going on now, where we do have generations, basically, of people who have grown up where wearing a helmet's just kind of normal. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes people are kind of liken it to wearing seatbelts, where, you know, if you're in the first generation where people insisted on, you know, the first generation of road of car drivers where the government insisted on you wearing a seatbelt, it probably did feel a bit weird to, you know, click clack when you got in the car.
Wasn't that slip slop?
Sorry?
Wasn't it slip slop rather than click
that's the sunscreen.
the sunscreen.
Yeah. But yeah, it is interesting, because when you ask about behaviour change, what you're really asking is about its habits. Like what are the kind of ingrained habits? How do people kind of relate themselves to various situations? And those habits change over time. Like it takes a long time to change those habits, unless, you know, people make it part of their kind of conscious decision making. There's a crisis or a pandemic, and, you know, to wear masks and things. It is kind of interesting. I would rather see the introduction of the kind of mandatory helmet laws as a lens through which to kind of problematize a range of other things. So rather than seeing it as like a trigger, which is the way it's framed, and a lot of people who aren't happy with kind of mandatory helmet laws, I would rather see it as a lens through which to kind of problematize a range of things to do with the habits and whatnot. Like, because at the end of the day, it's not the helmet that isn't, you know, making people feel unsafe. It's the kind of super aggressive road environment around them that's making them feel unsafe. So it's at best it's a symptom. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a cause. Like, governments have a lot to answer for in the way they've done this kind of bait and switch. Oh yeah, you can be safe if you just wear a helmet. Of course you're not bloody safe if you hit by a car. If you hit by a car going 60 k's an hour, then, you know, it's basically game over. You have kind of twice as much chance of living if it's only going kind of 50 k's an hour, and it doubles, you know, with each kind of 10 k's an hour drop. But yeah, in terms of behaviour change, I'd rather look at it in terms of habits. What are the habits that have been developed? And, you know, rather than a cause or the trigger for a kind of behaviour change, I'd rather see and think through helmets in terms of being a lens through which to kind of problematise a range of other things. So there's no easy answers to that, really.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's fun. Helen, I saw your hand was up. Did you want to ask a question now? Or I've got Alison Tilby's question pulls directly on what Glenn was saying there.
Yeah, no, I've realised something very important, Will, that you actually have a list of questions you're going off, so it's all good.
Yeah, trying to be equitable here. So Alison, you're not here today. I believe so. I'll ask your question from Turn It In. I'm going to go with your second one here. The biggest risk to cyclists is cars. However, in several states in Australia, it's illegal for adults to ride on footpaths. Because of this, would it be safer to legalise cycling on footpaths, which may encourage cycling, instead of enforcing helmet laws?
Want to have both? That's great. Yeah, no, yeah, I think I absolutely agree. Like, not being able to ride on footpaths is ridiculous. Yeah, I don't see the logic behind that, to be honest. So what do you, like, maybe there is an argument to be made, you're actually trying to protect kind of pedestrians, which would make perfect sense if there was a lot of pedestrians, but I'm not convinced there are a lot of pedestrians from the data I've seen. So there's that. The other dimension of it is for it to be safe enough to not wear helmets, particularly for low speed type accidents and other things. We need a far better kind of cycling kind of infrastructure. I don't think that's going to happen overnight kind of magically. So there will necessarily have to be, like, sure, we can get to a point where people don't have to wear helmets if they're going at a low speed and it's in kind of dedicated cycling infrastructure. But we actually don't have that yet. Like, there are little pockets of it around different places. So at kind of Olympic Park in Sydney, there's some pretty good cycling infrastructure. And I, could really see a reason why, if you kind of reduce the speed limits, why you couldn't have that as a bit of a precinct where people could ride without necessarily wearing a helmet. But more broadly, and in particular, if it's kind of population-wide kind of initiative on a national scale, then yeah, it would be years before I'd be super confident. Because the thing is, remember, you're talking about politicians, right? They don't want to introduce a rule, and all of a sudden, people aren't wearing helmets, and then next week, little Johnny has an accident, and like they had permanent brain damage because they weren't wearing a helmet, and all of a sudden it's that politician's fault. Like, that's fatal. So in a number of ways, which that's a bad metaphor, actually. Sorry. Anyway, but it's a bad.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is.
It's a risk that kind of politicians won't want to make, because what's at stake is the thing which they hold most dear. It's their career. So they're not going to change that overnight. So there's a couple of kind of parallel processes here, right? There's the habit stuff around kind of behaviour change. There's the investment in cycling infrastructure, which I think benefits everyone. And then there's the focus on helmets. So one of the questions I keep on asking myself is, why is there such this kind of fixation on wearing helmets when there's like a few other dimensions to it, where if there was the same amount of energy invested in cycling infrastructure, then maybe there would be like a better return in terms of improving the kind of rates of.
You mean like political energy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Zuleika, I don't know if I said your name previously, but Zuleika, and then Melissa Gray-Ward.
Yeah. So Glenn kind of changed my question a bit, but you mentioned that there's a large section of society that rides recreationally, and yet there must be some barriers that stop them from riding for commuting. Yeah, like I've read a bunch of research, and some of it, not all of it, but some of it suggests that repealing or relaxing mandatory helmet laws will increase cycling participation. But I mean, do you think that's the case, especially considering, that whole group of people who you think would be easily converted to, riding for active travel, like, your typical men in Lycra, like you'd kind of think they'd be pro helmet use because they're generally cycling on road and everything. So do you think relaxing laws in, like low speed environments would really lead to increased cycling as active travel?
Yeah, so we have to pull apart some of the figures a little bit to think through the different segments of the kind of population. So the mammals, the kind of middle-aged men in Lycra, they almost always certainly wear helmets. Like, I've not encountered too many mammals who don't actually want to wear a helmet. And most of the research, especially, and even from the pro-anti kind of mandatory helmet law people, they also indicate that downhill mountain bikers and fast-paced road cyclists should always wear helmets, basically, because there is a much greater risk that they could do themselves an injury, let alone in their encounter.
God, you'd have to be insane to be doing downhill mountain biking without a helmet.
Yeah. So,
not to value judge here, but I think, yeah.
And plus a range of other kind of safety gear. But anyway, so it's not so much the regular road cyclists who we're talking about. We're talking about the people who go out with their families. And and it's kind of akin to, you know, walking around the lake or something. Like that's the kind of cycling that we're talking about. That's the kind of cycling that's picked up when we talk about overall rates of cycling kind of participation. So so it's more about thinking through how do we create a safe environment so that those people don't necessarily have to wear a helmet. And it's so it's not the mammals. So it isn't people who we would kind of regard as a cyclist who we're actually trying to convince here. It's the people who dabble kind of recreationally in cycling, rather than identify with this notion of being a cyclist. So that's one of the other really interesting things that comes out of the helmet research is most people who would actually call themselves a cyclist find it really hard to believe that there are actually people who don't want to cycle because they have to wear a helmet. Like it's unbelievable to most cyclists because part of their identity is this really core sense of kind of resilience, right? Like if you're actually out there on the road or on the shared paths, whatever, cycling every single day, then you do have to be resilient. And so the act of putting on a helmet, which, you know, takes whatever 5 seconds, and wearing a helmet just doesn't seem to be that much of an inconvenience, right? Because your whole kind of identity is like configured around, you know, this notion of resilience. And so what we're really talking about when we're talking about getting the kind of recreational cyclists to become regular cyclists are the people who don't want to engage with that notion of resilience. So there's some other thing here that, you know, connects with sweat and all kinds of stuff, but there's something here to do with convenience. So we want to make it so convenient and so easy to cycle that you don't have to be resilient to take part, which means that you don't have to have this weird little kind of performative test of like wearing a helmet to signify that you're willing to be resilient enough to get out there and kind of mix it up amongst the traffic and, you know, people walking their dogs and stuff who aren't paying attention and all these other things. So it's not really the mammals that we're trying to convince here. The ones who are involved in this kind of sport-based kind of recreational cycling. It's the families. It's the other kind of recreational cyclists where they have very little interest in taking part in that notion of kind of resilience, for which wearing a helmet is really easy.
Is cycling oddly identity driven in Australia, or do all countries have cycling identities?
So most countries have a notion of what we would call a mammal. So I can't remember what it is, but in Dutch, it's whatever the Dutch word is for sport. I should know this. Anyway, they call them sport cyclists, and they basically mean the same thing. People who get dressed up in lycra and, you know, go out for hours and whatever, kind of abandon their families and just go riding.
Nice value judgment there, Glenn.
That's right. That's why it's, you know, there's a lot of stuff there with middle age. Anyway, they definitely have a sense of that kind of cyclist. But in other countries where it's part of everyday life, they don't have that same weird division between cyclists and other road users. Like kind of cyclists are the road users, right? So yes, they have that same sense of a sport cyclist, but not the same sense of, you know, cyclists as this kind of weird thing that, you know, isn't quite a car driver. It's just worth also pointing out there seems to be emergence of like a third category to do with kind of delivery drivers. So people who ride e-bikes in big kind of capital cities, who are mostly seen as other, like they're othered by the cyclists and the other road users to be this weird third category that seems to be emerging because they don't follow the road rules. They're way too fast compared to other cyclists because they're cheating with an e-bike, and, you know, they're doing all kinds of weird things like, you know, riding up footpaths, going up the wrong, you know, all the things that you see kind of cabbies do. It's basically, it's also the kind of e-bike riders do it too.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to go with a question from Melissa here. Melissa, you're not here? No. And this goes neatly to your expertise here, Glenn. Does Australian media show a bias against cycling culture when reporting on road fatalities involving cyclists? And then Hyeon Jun Choi.
That's a really interesting question. So the first thing is that most of the reporting about cycling is about fatalities. So, and road deaths and accidents. So that's in itself is a kind of fascinating way to represent it. It's not actually a focus on the sport, which you would think would be the second most important framing. It's actually framed from this kind of law and order type of kind of perspective around deaths, and there's been basically something go wrong to do with the road system, and now someone's died. So the framing of it is often in terms of a kind of negative representation with a focus on deaths when something goes wrong. There's very little other kinds of framings that you see in the media. So as part of my research, I've been going through, and with an RA, we've been going through the coverage. You can find it on our site, on our research site, cyclingcultures.org. We do a weekly roundup of the media coverage, and it's almost always negative. The framing is also really interesting because it's framed as if someone just kind of accidentally died and no one seems to be at fault, when more often than not, it's a cyclist or someone on their bike has been hit by someone driving a car. So often
can I just pause you there for a second? I know I could see the thinking process there when you said by someone driving a car, when so often it's framed not even as that, it's was hit by a car. Like the car is doing the thing, not the driver. That's
right. And so the kind of question of agency seems to be delegated to the system, not to the people who are within the system. And that's, people have kind of realized that previously. And as part of my research is just forming a bit of an evidence base with about a year's worth of sample from the Sydney media. So is there a bias? Well, it's interesting with the social media era. One of the things that's kind of fascinating is that it allows everyone to take part. We've lost the gatekeepers around. People used to control the circulation of public discourse. So now basically anyone with a kind of Facebook account can jump on to the Channel 7 News and express their opinion about what they think about cyclists, and they do. And most of the time it's negative. And they think it's great that there's been another cyclist that's been killed. So the bias, isn't necessarily as explicit in the news media reporting. Where you do find it, however, is in the comment threads. And just, as a bit of a tangent, one of the interesting things that's come out of this kind of CCC inquiry into Google and Facebook is one of the kind of recommendations is to give news services better control over their comment threads when they post news stories, because at the moment either you allow comments or you don't. There's very little kind of moderation type work allowed. And if they can moderate comments, I think there'll be a much nicer, more pleasant kind of public sphere through kind of social media. But yeah, so the news reporting, it's negative. And often the agency is delegated to the broader system of automobility rather than kind of particular users within it. And then it also provides an opportunity through social media where people who really dislike cyclists, hate them in fact, or seem to express hatred, can get up there and say terrible things.
Cool. So next we've got Hyun Jun Choi and then Sean Elliott. So Hyun is asking, in 2018, South Korea implemented a mandatory helmet law. However, it failed to create penalties if people violated the law due to public resistance. One of the reasons people oppose the new sanctions is that more than 90% of bicycle accidents in Korea occurred in the general road, not on the bicycle road. In other words, it's more necessary to expand bicycle-only facilities than the use of bicycle helmets. Was there a policy in Australia to expand bicycle-only facilities at the same time? Have governments done anything there?
No, there wasn't a policy. So it's fascinating. As a part of the research coming out of our Sydney team, we've looked at the barriers, I guess, to if our cycling and active transport more generally is seen as this overwhelming positive for economic well-being, health-related, all these issues, right? If it's seen as a positive, why is there such a reluctance from governments? And so we we've kind of landed on two big things. One is the thing around evidence. So if you look at kind of cycling policy articles, right, things where they're talking about changing cycling policy, you will almost always find someone who says, we need to have more evidence. We need to have an evidence base. Where's the evidence? And they actually mobilize this logic of, we don't have the perfect bit of research yet that indicates the perfect course of action. Therefore, the best course of action to take is no action. There's a really good example of that to do with speed limits in yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald, where the City of Sydney wants to reduce speed limits to 30 k's an hour. And one of the independent councillors has come out and said, well, hang on, well, slow down. We don't actually have an evidence base for that yet. We need to get the evidence, then we can make a decision. Well, that's complete bullshit. Sorry to use some kind of technical language. There's actually a huge amount of evidence around kind of reducing speed limits. And part of our argument is that when there's this call for like perfect evidence, it actually is a barrier to taking action that in most other circumstances seems to indicate that it's a, like,
you almost could apply this to sort of a climate change type scenario.
It's a range of things. The other thing is around kind of aspirational targets. So even though it seems good that, you know, federal politicians throughout the 2000s and early 2010s came out and announced as a part of the national cycling strategy. So just a, you know, quick kind of detour, we had a series of national cycling strategies that mirrored and followed quite closely the kind of gathering of data around the national cycling surveys. Can't remember what the actual title was. Anyway, they were kind of facilitated through Ausroads, and they were tasked with gathering data. So there was a series of these. There was a series of national cycling strategies. The national cycling strategies were always pitched in terms of aspirational targets, right? And so what seems to have happened is there's this weird shift away from thinking about the actual kind of material conditions by which people taking part in active transport need to take part in more active transport, to thinking about governance being an act of kind of, you know, kind of performatively framing good governance in terms of aspirational targets. So we're aiming for this number of people to take part in active transport, therefore wash my hands, job's done, I've done my national kind of leadership responsibilities, rather than going, okay, we're going to make an instruction where state governments have to invest part of their road transport budgets in active transport kind of infrastructure. So, you know, if there was a minimum kind of requirement of investment rather than an aspirational target of kind of taking part in cycling, then I think you would have found a much better return on investment. So yeah, so that's a long way of answering the question around, was there an investment in cycling only or active transport type infrastructure at the time of the introduction of the kind of mandatory helmet laws? No, there wasn't. And there's been this weird kind of bifurcation to do with we need greater evidence, but you're never going to get the evidence, therefore we can't take action, and aspirational type kind of policy targets, which, you know, you're never going to hit because you're actually setting targets around the wrong thing.
Awesome. I am definitely going to pull out that line about we need more evidence. You know, so critical to what we're doing in this whole course, and such a common line that people use to stop things. Sean Elliott, and then Daphne Woodcock.
Hi, Glenn. Since submitting this question, it feels like you may have answered parts of this already. So I'll try and restate it a little bit. But I read a paper that was along the lines of suggesting that we were fixated too much on bicycle helmets rather than on other infrastructure for cyclists. So the question was, are we fixated on bicycle helmets for cyclist safety, and should we instead be putting more thought into bicycling infrastructure to separate cyclists from heavy traffic, that sort of thing? Again, I feel if you've already kind of answered that, then I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, there is a bit of a kind of fixation there. It's fascinating because it's a single piece of kind of equipment of like technology, and like what it also does is it kind of reduces the field of action to there being this single kind of pressure point. So in some ways, you know, it's kind of interesting that it mobilizes so many people around it. When if you think about, you know, the different kind of positions being made, the different arguments, and how those people are actually situated, like where are they arguing from? Like at what point are they arguing from? So the kind of bicycle network is a really good, really interesting example where, you know, they're arguing from like a Melbourne perspective, I guess, like, because they used to be kind of, actually now I've forgotten the name of it. I think it was either Cycling Victoria or something like that. Anyway, they've rebranded themselves when they became the kind of bicycle network as this kind of nationally, as like a national kind of organisation, but they're still grounded in Melbourne. And Melbourne has pretty good cycling infrastructure. It's much better than Sydney, at least. It's nowhere near as good as Canberra, but it's still pretty good. And it's actually very good for an Australian, like, you know, kind of capital city. I think Perth may have finally pipped it in terms of its cycling kind of infrastructure. But yeah, it's worth just thinking through, where are these people actually arguing from? Like, not only, you know, kind of physically, what kind of infrastructure are they exposed to on a daily basis, but actually, you know, kind of what are their interests? Because they're mobilizing arguments not simply about cycling, but about you know, about freedom and all kinds, like a range of things. And you see some people come out swinging, like, kind of against helmets, and, you know, their interest really isn't in helmets. It's just this point of focus, when what they're really, you know, getting angry about are things like just kind of government regulation in general and a range of things. There's some people who really don't like government, you know, this is the way they experience it. They really don't like government kind of telling them what to do. And so they focus on helmets because they think that there's like a positive dimension too. Oh, we're not arguing about government regulation. We're actually arguing about freedom to cycle. And we want more people to cycle because it's such a good thing. And so, you know, they sort of get on side, and it's just this weird, there's this weird kind of network. Because really, if they were interested in cycling, then they would be arguing, oh, we need to reduce speed limits. We need to have greater kind of cycling infrastructure on it. So they take up arms and they focus on this one piece of equipment, on this one kind of technology, which I think is kind of emblematic of a broader range of issues. Yeah. So the kind of situatedness, I guess, is important of when people argue for these things or argue against them, how and where are they actually situated is worth asking.
It's almost like, you know, people do get weirdly situated and weirdly fixated on being told to wear things on the whole head area. There may be a similar sort of politics going on with those who are resisting masks now, choosing the evidence that they want, interpreting it in their own sort of way, and then resisting it because it fits into certain identities that they do or don't want to take on. I don't think they're a straight parallel, but I think there are certainly similar things going on with the masks at the moment. Daphne Woodcock's not here. Helen, you'll be after this. So Daphne says, studies have shown that wearing a helmet gives bike riders a false sense of security and thus increases their potential for harm. Does this increased risk also extend to kids?
I don't know. It's not really my area of research. Let me draw another parallel to calls for making cyclists more visible. So one of the things I didn't talk about when I talked about the reporting on cyclist deaths is often their clothing and their kind of appearance is kind of regarded as noteworthy. So a famous example of that, well, kind of relatively famous example of that, is Mike Hall, the kind of endurance athlete who died just outside of Canberra when he was taking part in the what was it called? India Pacific Wheel Race, where you ride across Australia. And one of the comments made was that apparently he was wearing dark clothing, and therefore, you know, it wasn't really the driver's fault when the driver was looking at his kind of mobile phone and as the coroner found, and hit the cyclist. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's a cyclist's fault because they're not wearing the right kind of clothes, which in terms of parallels to other kind of vulnerable kind of populations, it's very similar to the arguments made about women and the sort of clothes that women wear when they're out in public, and to do with kind of sexual violence. So hopefully I'm not triggering anyone here, but it's interesting the ways in which the risky cycling environment is somehow kind of forgotten, because it is actually risky. The way that we've set up the cycling environment has greater risks for people who ride bikes, because it's actually not set up for them. It's kind of set up for car drivers. So it's a long way around. It's a kind of circuitous way of responding to that, where I don't know, it's not my area of expertise. I don't know what kind of cyclists are experiencing when they're actually riding, and if they think that, you know, they're not at risk. I find that extremely hard to believe, because most people who are cyclists, if you're talking about people who would regard themselves as cyclists, are fully aware of the risks. Another good example of that is the fellow Cameron Frewer, who was a kind of cycling safety advocate up in Queensland, who was killed. He wrote a letter to his family. He used to post videos of the kind of close passes, right? And he wrote a letter to his family saying, one day I'm going to be killed by a driver. And then he was killed. Someone who, basically swerved. It seemed like he swerved to actually hit Cameron. So should have been plenty of space. In terms of riding, he should have been completely fine, but he wasn't. And he was fully aware of the risks. So yeah, it's really interesting to think that there's a kind of false sense of security by wearing a helmet, when I don't think that's the case. I think people, cyclists, are kind of fully aware of the risks. Yeah.
There's I was doing a whole bunch of work on the arguments around when seatbelts were brought in. So in the 70s and 80s in the UK. And as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of people screaming nanny state at that point. And there were a bunch of people who tried to argue that this would give drivers a false sense of security, and then would take more risks because they would have a seatbelt on. So people love this sort of argument.
Actually, so do you know what's fascinating? The whole seatbelt thing, there's some great work done on the history of road safety, right? And it's just fascinating thinking about the kind of introduction of airbags. So like airbags were developed because people in the US, there's many states in the US where they don't have kind of seatbelt laws. And yet, you know, basically car kind of manufacturers didn't want to be sued for making things that were kind of inherently unsafe. So they like developed these like passive safety technologies, one of which is the airbag. So the airbag was introduced because people didn't want to wear seatbelts. And it's just like crazy to think about, you know, this whole, you know, and now cars are like safer because we have airbags, right? Which is great. Sure. But it's just, you know, crazy to think about how airbags were invented literally because people, like quite literally because people didn't want to wear seatbelts. So yeah, I don't know. There's some weird stuff going on there to do with risk and people's perceived
risk. There is some probable justice to the argument in the sense, you know, it has a truthiness in the sense of, you know, some people at the time were saying, okay, you want to make cars safer. The number one thing that would make them safer is putting a giant spike on the steering wheel, so that, you know, you have a crash over 40 k's an hour and you're instantly dead. Sure, that you know, as a hyperbolic form of argument, yes, that does carry some weight, but that's not the world that people operate in. So, okay, Helen and then Nicola.
Yeah, so I'm just first of all going to make a joke. Really, if you want to make cars safe, couldn't you mandate helmet wearing for car drivers? Just saying, would make it safer. There's a great comedy sketch by Seinfeld asking why parachutists wear crash helmets. It's you know. So my question is actually about Lycra Rage. So my husband's Dutch. He's been in Australia for all of 7 years, and on his very first day cycling in Australia, 2 months in, a car tried to run him off the road and told him to get off the road because the road was for cars. So my question is more that strong anti-cyclist sentiment from drivers may actually be discouraging people from driving. And this sort of adds to the whole helmet from cycling. And it sort of adds to the whole discouragement effect that you get from some people who are discouraged from wearing a helmet. Well, you have people who are discouraged by road rage. So how can we make cycling a more socially accepted activity? Because reducing driver rage towards cyclists would presumably make it safer for cyclists to be on the road.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think there's, again, this is another way to think about a whole series of variables, right? So what you're asking is about the kind of normalization of active transport is another way to think about it. So rather than emphasizing, the the system of I guess what can we call it? Kind of powered automobility, right? Oh God, there's a lot of work that has to happen for cycling and active transport to be normalised. One of the things I think is worth thinking about, and again, I'm just going to go off on a bit of a tangent, is to think about how towns in the UK, like their actual kind of spatiality kind of developed. So originally towns were the distance apart that, like, I think it was a Roman legion, but that doesn't make sense. Anyway, some army could march in a day, right? So you could march in a day, they set up a camp, that camp turned into a town. And then eventually along came kind of railroads, and they invested in railroads. So they then built kind of stations in each town, which was just an accident. Like how far could you march in a day? And then it got turned into the place where the train station was. And then they built roads around it. So now you've got this, layers of kind of infrastructure, which kind of rearticulates the location of the town. So in Australia, except for maybe in Canberra, where we do have like weird kind of satellite town things, but in most places in Australia, what we actually have are suburbs. And we have this layered infrastructure where suburbs have been planned to a certain extent, but they've been organised around things like freeways and the car as the dominant form of transport. So when you come up against the problem of how do you normalise active transport, one thing that's worth thinking about is that sometimes the things that have to change aren't actually people's beliefs or habits or sense of kind of proprietary around who should be on the road and who shouldn't. It's actually, more kind of material things, like the fact that someone lives kind of 30 minutes drive away from where they work, because we set up the cities in Australia as if, powered automobility is the normal form of transport. So there's a whole range of other habits and other cultural values that we need to start thinking about, like how do we encourage people to actually live near their kind of places of work, not like in their places of work, like how it used to happen prior to the emergence of factories and whatever, in the big cities in Europe. But I mean like near it, so you can actually walk or you can ride, and it's not this huge, effort every day where you really need to be resilient, right? And it's this kind of convenience factor. So there's like a range of issues going on here, like a range of kind of processes where the person who's angry at your husband for, being on the road may not be angry at your husband in particular because they're a cyclist. They're angry that they have to be in a car and drive places because that is actually literally the way that their lives are organized, because their place of residence is so far from kind of wherever they're working. There's a whole range of other things to do with the pace of modern life. So, you think about how regularly you need to like race around and get places on time because whatever, you've got so many things going on in your life, it's actually really hard to just get places. And how that really makes it hard to have a more leisurely mode of transport, kind of simply because you are rushing about in different places. So parents often make that argument about trying to organize their kids, right? Like, all the kids' activities and getting to school and stuff. It's actually really hard to drop a child off at school or children off at school and then get to work if you're riding a bike. Like, I manage it because school's on the way to work. So I can, I kind of drop off my daughter. But it's actually really difficult if you're somewhere else and all of a sudden, rather than taking 20, 30 minutes, it takes like an hour. And it's just kind of full on. So, sorry, again, what I'm trying to do is move away from the idea that it's a set of beliefs that you have to change, to point out that there's actually kind of, there are kind of material conditions that help shape these beliefs that aren't just in someone's head. It's in their kind of patterns of living and their lifestyles, which is a far more kind of complex set of problems.
I think, yeah. Have I not asking you, Glenn, asking the rest of the class, have I done the rant with you? Did we do the rant a couple of weeks ago? So the improv game, the 2-minute rant, and then you rant to each other, and then you have to introduce each other. And Glenn, just to tell you the context here, it's a game where people rant about a topic for 2 minutes, and then the other person has to introduce them, but using only positive words. The point is, it's about deep listening, and it's about understanding the values that motivate people. and you know, underneath their anger, you know, their anger at the cyclist or whatever, is something that they actually want. They want to get to work on time, and they want to get their kids to all of their activities. They want all of these positive things. But I also think, you know, I often ask, can people keep going? And there's, you know, that 10 to 15% of people that could keep ranting forever. And I think that might be pointing to systemic problems. When we have, you know, big systems that are set up against us, that there are so many aspects in our lives that our cities are organized in ways that are not conducive to us achieving our values. So it manifests in so many different ways. And I think it's tough. It's tough because it's really hard to re-engineer our cities here. You know, it's not something that we can just do overnight. And maybe that's why helmets became a focal point for this campaign or this anger, because, you know, it's a law that we can change, and it's something that people will resist. But it's those cyclists saying, no, I do want you to make our cities safer for cycling. Nicola, and then Ashley.
Okay, good morning. So my question sort of comes back to, you mentioned before about e-bikes being this weird category that don't necessarily follow the rules all the time. So I've been reading that e-bike usage among older populations and increasingly with teens and children is on the rise. And e-bike accidents appear to cause more severe injuries than conventional bike accidents. So they sort of are more in line with what you'd expect from a motorcycle accident. So if we shifted this compulsory bike helmet wearing, do you think it should apply across the board, or should it be sort of a bit selective, sort of working on what we know about potential e-bike injuries, or should we have a tougher approach on the e-bike helmet use?
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's really interesting set of problems there. Firstly, yeah, I wasn't talking about kind of e-bike riders so much as kind of food delivery riders. That was that seemed to be the kind of category of road user that got people a bit angry in some of our focus groups.
Yeah.
So far, but most of them ride e-bikes, right? That's the thing. So there's a few issues going on there. Let me see if I can just move my webcam over to show you my e-bike. There you go. That's what I commute on every day. It is interesting. In Australia, at least, we have kind of particular rules around the design of e-bikes, which you can kind of, you can always kind of circumnavigate. Anyway, the rules mean that you can't have kind of assistance over kind of 25 k's an hour. So for a regular cyclist, that is actually not very fast. I would sit on easily 30 kind of k's an hour on my kind of commuting bike, let alone my weekend nice carbon bike. So 25 k's an hour is not that fast for a regular cyclist, but for someone who's come from that recreational mode of cycling around the lake with their families and doesn't have a lot of kind of embodied experience, knowledge around road handling and whatnot, it is actually kind of relatively quick. The other thing about e-bikes is that they're super heavy. So that my bike is like a whole bunch of carbon stuff on it. It still weighs like 20 kilos. It's ridiculous. I built an e-bike a number of years ago now, just, with kids, and, you can do this anyway. I won't go into the details of it, but it only weighs like kind of 13 or 14 kilos, which is a big difference. And it makes it easier to handle. It's a much nicer bike to ride. So when we're talking about cycling, they are very, very different things. From my way of thinking, I wouldn't actually locate e-bikes in the same category as cycling as we would normally kind of think about it. I would see it as an alternative to driving. So I know this seems weird because it seems like we've been talking about this the whole time, but we actually haven't. To be a cyclist means that you need to, kind of accept all the bad things that are happening, on the road, and you have to be resilient and all these things. To ride an e-bike, because it doesn't have the same burdens around getting sweaty, around that notion of resilience. Like, there's still some things you have to take into account. It makes it a bit easier, and so it's like a different category from my kind of perspective, the two main tensions around kind of convenience and resilience that you need to think about when you're talking about habits for active transport. It's got a different kind of configuration of those things compared to a non-powered bicycle. So do we need to think about them in a similar way to motorbike, to kind of motorcyclists? Maybe. In different places around the world, they have different rules around e-bikes. So I like the rules in the US, actually, some parts of the US, where they have a very similar arrangement to us, where they have the limits around the power and the speed and stuff. But then they have this other category of like tourers, where it's, you know, it's still restricted, but they're much higher speed levels and kind of power levels and stuff. And that's what I'd like to see, because I don't know, like in Australia, if you're going to ride on the road, that seems to me you're actually mixing it up with traffic, and it's far more comparable to the sort of things that you would want. What am I trying to say? Yeah, it is. I think we do need to treat them slightly differently, but I still think that it's, you know, kind of shades of grey. Those kind of categories aren't kind of black and white. At the moment, it makes sense with our current design rules to treat them the same way as you would any other cyclist. Yep.
Awesome. Ashley, are you here? And then I've got a Stephanie, but I know there's Stephanie's in here, but I don't know the last name. So look, let's just go with the Stephanie that's in here.
And the Ashley, I'm here.
You're here. You go first, Ashley, and then we'll go with Stephanie.
Cool. I think a lot of the question has kind of been touched on, but I was mainly curious about the social and cultural opinions around cycling that are at play. For reference, I live in mountains, and we have lots of like athlete cyclists up in the mountains. However, it's extremely dangerous up here for cyclists and drivers because of the bends and the small roads, and there's a lot of negative cultural opinions around it, justified on both sides. But I was curious to look at like Amsterdam versus Australia. Do you think the same cultural acceptance will ever be there in Australia compared to these other European countries?
Maybe. I think so. If it does happen, it'll be kind of localized. I don't think it'll ever be national, like in Holland. I just find that very hard to believe. Mainly because there's some places in Australia where it probably isn't suitable to ride a bike, unless, you know, we have some massive kind of catastrophic thing happen and it's the end of the world and we can't get petrol anymore. And of course, we're all going to be riding, so that's great. But no, I think it'll be localized, like different areas will be kind of far more kind of cycling friendly compared to others. So Canberra in particular is like a cycling friendly city. There's a lot of great infrastructure. A lot of people are far more considerate to cyclists and the risks involved. Which hills do you live in? What hills are you talking about?
Sorry, I'm in Victoria, so the Mount Dandenong Ranges, like the Great Divide, so
yep.
pretty mountainy. Yeah,
it's interesting. There seems to be some areas which are the complete inverse, where you're never going to get that kind of those kind of allowances around what's required to help kind of facilitate active transport. Some of it seems to be baked into the kind of natural geography, like mountains and other things. Yeah. Other times the flashpoints seem to be created because of the different kinds of investment in infrastructure. Like again, in Melbourne, a lot of the kind of seaside areas just seems to be, you know, kind of designed to like create friction, I guess. In Canberra, at certain times of the day, it's around the lakes, the big lakes, where the infrastructure is such that, you know, you can avoid tension and, you know, kinds of antagonisms, but actually most people don't think about it like that. They just think that they've got a right to do whatever they're doing and kind of bugger everyone else, basically. But,
so you could say that there might be a cultural change at some point, but geography is kind of a really heavy influence with that. So there's really no change. Like you can't predict a change, and geography will have a big play in
that. In some cases, it'll be geography. In other places, yeah, it's to do with the infrastructure, the kind of baked in kind of material constraints. Which is why, you know, like the bigger point to tie in with the conversation around helmets is that that's why I find the focus on helmets as being like this single point, this single you know, kind of piece of equipment which is going to change everything. I just find those arguments really hard to believe, not because it's not necessarily true that maybe some people will take up cycling if they don't have to wear a helmet, but there's all these other constraints, yeah, some of which are to do with kind of geography, but most of the time it's to do with the infrastructure. So, because there's ways around geography, like you can set up, you know, rules around certain times of the day. These are the, you know, cyclists are here and everyone else just has to not use those bits of road or whatever. Like that'll annoy some people, but, you know, if the cyclists are ratepayers and they're whatever, paying for the roads as well, then why not? Like, yeah, that doesn't seem to be any kind of sensible reason why they shouldn't be allowed to just have kind of cycling only parts of the day. But yeah, so there's all these other constraints, I guess, is a bigger point I want to make. Some of which are to do with geography, but there's ways around that if you introduce kind of rules and regulation.
Cool, thanks.
All right, Stephanie, and then Diana, and then at some point we'll just pitch to any burning questions people might have.
My original question was originally about, helmets taking away from the real sort of barriers to cyclist safety. And I think you've talked a lot about that. And it seems the main barriers to that are the sheer size of the investment required to sort of create a better cycling culture and infrastructure. If you want to talk more about that, you can. My other question, which I've made up sort of just now, is you mentioned returning cyclists in relation to the lockdown, people picking up bikes that they hadn't used for a while. What does someone who hasn't cycled since high school need to think about if they want to become a cycling commuter asking for a friend?
That's a good question. So the size of the investment, that's a really interesting way to frame it, because compared to the investment in roads and the infrastructure for powered automobility, it's actually tiny. Just the amount of money that's put into active transport infrastructure. So I don't know, there's various figures around, you can find them, but it's only like a few kind of percentage points. It's nothing. There's barely any investment. If you compare it to cities like London, so here I'm thinking about Sydney and Melbourne, as major kind of capital cities in the world. If you compare that to the investment that's happened over the last decade in active transport infrastructure in London, then you really get a sense of how far behind the curve we are in Australia. So it's not actually a huge investment. That's the point I'm making. It's actually just a slightly bigger, tiny investment. Is all that's required. So one cool thing that you can find if you want to get into cycling and you want to start thinking about it, and there's just a whole bunch of so I like mapping things in my mind, right? That's just the way I think, and all the different variables in place and the different systems and whatever. And so one thing that's worth thinking about is how little it costs to actually get into cycling kind of compared to other forms of mobility. So if you're driving a car, it's much cheaper. Even if you just have the car sitting at home, paying a rego and whatever, you don't have to pay for parking. There's all this stuff. I haven't actually driven to my office for 3 years. So there's 3 years worth of parking I haven't paid for. And that's basically paid for my e-bike. So it's much cheaper to ride. So because you do need a little bit of upfront investment is the first thing. Get a D-lock. That's the second thing, because you want to lock it up. You don't want your bike stolen. Don't worry about any of the cable locks. Sometimes they're more convenient. That's great if you're just running in to buy a coffee and you want it to be, really quick. But it's just as quick to have a D-lock. There's all different kinds of D-locks. You're never going to stop someone from stealing your bike if they have infinite time and whatever, but you're just going to make it really hard. You just want your bike to be, not the easiest bike to steal on the bike rack. And if you have a D-lock, then you can always guarantee that it won't be the easiest bike to steal. The third thing is have a look at all the different kinds of bikes, because for a little bit more money, often you can buy a bike that's much, much better than not even the cheapest bike, but the second kind of cheapest bike. Get a bike that's lighter. So, steel frame bikes, they're great. If you're, kind of riding across a continent or something, because you can just get it welded up by some bloke in the middle of nowhere. But if you're just kind of commuting in Canberra or where in some urban area, get a lighter bike. Getting good kind of quality tires. After the first lot of tires get a puncture, That's another good idea. But yeah, so just having a chat with people. So what we found when people, you know, the things that they had to access and think about when they got back on their bikes was like advice. So often I'd get that from family and friends about the shifts in kind of cycling technology and things like that. Often maintenance, if they already had a bike, you know, they needed some advice around what it meant to maintain their bike. So in Canberra, if you're in Canberra, Pedal Power at least used to run workshops around bike maintenance. In Sydney, the City of Sydney hires and pays local bike shops to run pop-up bike mechanic kind of things, like on the major kind of commuting routes. Because often there's some dumb, annoying thing that's like there's something ticking, or there's something slightly slipping, or some other stupid thing that's happening with your bike that, you know, if you're into bikes or if you're a bike mechanic, you sort of know, oh, that's just a slight adjustment of this thing. And it takes like 30 seconds, but it makes the experience much, much nicer. So at the moment, my e-bike, like it's slipping in the top gears because I needed a new, like a new kind of cassette. So I've ordered one on the internet, online, and it's going to come this week, hopefully. But at the moment, it's like super annoying because in the top gears, it's just like slipping every now and again. Tick, like it just, you know, it's really frustrating. Anyway, so the fifth thing, just lastly, is having a look at the routes. So Google Maps now has a cyclist kind of wayfinding part of its platform. So definitely investigate that. Strava, the mammal platform, used to have a free...
Totally is the mammal platform, isn't it?
a free kind of route finding service, but they've taken that away. So now it's only part of the paid platform. That only happened last month, actually, which is super bloody annoying because I used to recommend that to everyone because it's great. And it's based around this kind of algorithmic mapping. So it'll take you along the most frequently used routes that are based around Strava users. And even though they are mostly mammals, most Strava users will use the safest routes. So it was always a good thing. But anyway, Google's pretty good. It knows most of the routes. That's a good first step. And you can do like a practice run on the weekend, right? That's what I would also kind of recommend. So I've actually lent my e-bike that I built a few years ago to my admin person here, who's in the kind of next office, and she's just started cycling, and she rides like kind of most days of the week. That's the other thing. You don't have to fully commit. Like you don't have to ride kind of 5 days a week. If you think about it, if you only ride 2 days a week, that's like a kind of 40% drop in like emissions or whatever. So just think about it like that. If it's beautiful, like today in Canberra is amazing, you know, it'd be a fantastic day to ride in. It's great weather. You don't get too sweaty because it's still, you know, it's kind of autumnal. So the temperature's nice. Yeah. So that's the sixth thing, I guess. You don't have to do it every day. Mm.
Andrew, you've got your hand up. Did you want to throw in here?
Yes. So I've disclosed in the chat that I am a mammal. So middle-aged man in Lycra. I'm almost 40, and I do back because I'm also in Melbourne, so no more commuting to work at the moment. But I used to ride to work back when we were still doing that. So I've seen some reports of sort of companies around the world or governments around the world who've sort of put in incentives to try and get more people to switch their mode. So to try and get more people riding. So Glenn, what would you think would be a good idea for whether it would be for businesses or governments to try and incentivize their employees to reduce traffic? Would they be, you know, some sort of rebate from the government or tax incentive or something like that?
That's a great question. I would ask a slightly earlier question is, do governments actually want to incentivize active transport? Mm. So one of the massive problems that citizens face if they do think it's a good idea for people to get out there on their bikes or whatever, walk to work, all kinds of things, and not use a car, is that a lot of at least the state-based infrastructure is organised around quite literally making money from cars as like a revenue source. This is not just me being kind of pedantic and like whatever bloody cars sort of thing. It's actually like a huge problem. If you take away at least a sizable chunk of the car driving public and all of a sudden you turn off that revenue source, a lot of the other things that state governments do, they can no longer do. And maybe they don't have to do them as much if there aren't as many health, negative health kind of outcomes because there's less cars on the road and all kinds of things. But yeah, there's some massive issues there to do with not only the incentives for citizens to get from behind wheels and get on their bikes or whatever, there's also a lack of incentive for governments to actually incentivize active transport. Sydney in particular is kind of particularly problematic with their state government because there's close connections between the companies that own toll roads and the current state government.
Transurban.
Mm.
So just to follow on from that, sorry if I may, do you mean sort of the disincentives for governments of those relationships with the big sort of multinational road building infrastructure giants like Transurban, but also revenue coming from people having to sort of pay for their car rego, sort of taxes? I don't know, taxes pay for roads.
So that's definitely the kind of first order issues. But once you start thinking about it, you start to realize how much of the economy is actually organized around, powered automobility. So to a certain extent, that probably would be replaced if people started riding bikes, by the sectors in the economy. But at the moment, even if there was like a 10% drop in the number of people driving their cars, like that is therefore a kind of 10% hit to certain sectors within the economy that are organized, things like it's just crazy, like all the maintenance stuff to do with cars. Like there's a whole range of stuff that we've organized around helping to kind of facilitate and enable people to have powered automobility. So when I talk about that layered approach to kind of infrastructure, it's not just the hard infrastructure, it's what urban planners talk about in terms of the kind of soft infrastructure, different kind of sectors in the economy that are organized around enabling people to use cars as the most convenient mode of transport. So it isn't just like journeys and driving, it's things like the upkeep, the way, like the whole kind of kind of economy organized around energy. So petrol and because that is a super dense kind of energy source, right? But what we often forget is it's taken kind of millions of years for that petrol to be created, or at least the base elements of it to be created, so then we could use it for to make it more convenient to drive kind of 40 minutes in traffic. So yeah, there's whole sectors of the economy that are organized around powered automobility and making it the most convenient, in scare quotes, form of our transport. So there's the disincentive kind of in terms of the way that we've organized politics, in particular in Sydney and in that state. Where there are close connections between the companies that own the toll roads and the kind of Liberal Party in particular. There's been some news coverage around that if you want to investigate it. But then, there's the kind of second order kind of effects, this huge shift that would have to undergo if we did start moving away from cars, where people would feel, really concerned. Like it's of the scale of our current shutdown. That probably gives you some idea about what would happen if all of a sudden there was less business oriented towards those companies, those small businesses that serviced kind of automobility.
Awesome. Okay, let's do a few of these burning questions, and then we'll let Glenn get back to real work. Mia.
Hey, Glenn. Thanks for letting us pick your brain this morning. My question, and I realise you've made it very clear to us that this whole issue is way bigger than mandated helmet legislation, but that's what we've been asked to really consider. So I want to try and bring it back to thinking about that and the political angle. Globally, autonomous vehicles are predicted to become more common and affordable over the next 30 years. I was trying to think about, okay, how does that impact? And I've read some papers about how cyclists behave differently around autonomous vehicles compared to those driven by people. And wondered, do you see there being a role for cyclist helmets to serve as a safety mechanism by using smart technology that will interact to improve safety between autonomous cars and cyclists? And how might that work from a political angle? And do you think it could be used to motivate improved rates of helmet wearing around the world?
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't trust all autonomous vehicles in the slightest, to be honest. That's cool. That's oh, sweet mercy. That's a kettle of fish. But the okay. So yeah, so I actually own a Tesla. So I use the kind of autopilot function quite regularly. It's called highway autopilot. Anyway, it's like one of the early versions of it. And it works quite well when you're on highways, like around Canberra, you know, the areas where it's 80, I guess is the simplest way to think about it. I would never use it anywhere that isn't in that space. So the jump from highway-based autonomous vehicles to ones that can drive literally from to and from your, you know, kind of place of departure to your destination, I think are a fair way off.
They reckon 30 years, so you can just sit in and say where you're going and it'll drive you there.
Yeah.
And for that to be affordable and common. This
raises a whole bunch of other issues to do with, like, I guess what's called kind of smart cities versus smart kind of technologies in those cities. So when you think about autonomous vehicles, one of the other approaches is to think about how cities themselves have become smart rather than having kind of ultra smart things in those cities, if that makes sense. So all of these ways of thinking about urban environments requires a certain layer of information that can be then read and kind of communicated amongst people who are in that environment. So either it's the car itself that's reading, you know, signs, really simple stuff, trying to kind of replicate humans, or it's the city itself that's smart and there's sensors embedded in the city that are kind of communicating and talking about the things that are moving within the space, right? So there's this weird kind of bifurcation. People want smart cars, not smart cities, because they can sell you a car. They can't sell you a smart city, right? And so there's this weird thing going on there to do with kind of commodities and stuff. Anyway, it'll be interesting to think about whether or not at some point in the future, cyclists and other people taking part in active transport are required to be a point in that information layer. So do they make themselves more present to the senses? So it's not a question of kind of visibility, wearing lycra or yellow or fluoro clothes, whatever, so car drivers can see them. Will we have this moral panic around cyclists not wearing their sensor or something so they're more visible to the kind of machine sensors, to that kind of system of vision either built into cars or whatever they are, or built into the environment? I think it's kind of inevitable that we actually will kind of require people to have a sensor. I don't know, this is probably going to trigger people who are offended by wearing helmets. Oh, Mark.
I was going to say, I can hear the privacy alarms going off.
Yeah, I'm going to go nuts if everyone has to wear a sensor. So then they become more present to the...
Well, that's what I was thinking. You'd have some kind of smart technology, and if you made that in the helmet rather than on the bike...
Mobile phones.
Maybe cyclists that would be motivated because they're scared of being hit by an autonomous vehicle would be more inclined to wear a helmet.
Yeah, but maybe we shouldn't allow things into the space if it can't detect not hitting us.
So it's so there's all these weird tensions going on. Like I'm not sure if everyone realizes it yet, but our street lamps in Canberra have actually been replaced by smart street lamps that in them have a little kind of Bluetooth, what's it called? Kind of sniffer, right? So it can pick up when there's someone walking past that has like an open Bluetooth device. And they haven't started using that yet, but the technology has already been installed, right? So this is, I think, we're in the midst of this kind of transformation of our urban environments, at least. I don't think it's going to happen in rural spaces, to be honest, but in our urban environments where we have this kind of information layer kind of across everything. And yeah, it'll be less a case of safety because you have to wear a helmet and more a case of safety because you have to have your sensor, right? That's that's where I can see that going. I don't think helmets, maybe the sensor will be built into helmets. That seems to be a sensible
Well, if you wanted people to wear the helmets, that's where you'd put it, right? You'd legislate so that it has to be in the helmet, not on the bike.
Kate.
Hi, Glenn. Thank you for talking to us today. After dipping into some of the research, I had this overwhelming impression that the research wasn't quality and it wasn't strong or of a good quality. Is that a defence for not doing anything, like on the anti-helmet side? Are they just using that as a defence, or is some of the research not clear, or is it too hard? I read something that it was even too hard to model the situation. It was too complex.
Yeah, I think there are, well, for starters, I think it is probably too hard to retrospectively isolate helmet wearing as a single variable has had an impact on the rates of cycling kind of participation. You can infer a lot of things from it if you wanted to, like that's great, and maybe some people are actually convinced by those arguments. But in terms of like a slam dunk, you know, here's my experiment that I run where it's all the different constraints you need to have a kind of slam dunk kind of scientific argument. Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to be able to kind of replicate the right kind of conditions to have perfect evidence, which means that there's always going to be this element of argument, right? So it's not actually based around a kind of logical, kind of scientific, kind of pure process, which means that any evidence that's mobilized is going to have to be framed in the form of an argument. So then the question becomes, am I actually convinced by this evidence? Am I convinced by this argument? And when it comes to the helmet stuff, like it's just curious, like has there been research that's kind of contextualized the shifts in the early 90s to think through whether other things happening at the time, other variables which may indicate why there was a downturn? Like what actually was going on with like kind of teenage girls, and why do they not want to kind of cycle anymore? Is it to do with helmets, or is it to do with this other thing to do with kind of resilience and sweat and, you know, people sort of becoming aware of themselves in the world in a slightly different way in their teenage years? Maybe they don't want to be dorky and wear a helmet. But anyway, so there's a range of ways to kind of contextualize the current evidence. And until I see a thorough kind of exploration of how that evidence can be kind of contextualized, to me it appears as if there's like cherry picking, right? These kind of inferences that are drawn between population-wide shifts and then that kind of being reduced to a single variable, to me seems incredibly problematic. Like part of my own kind of research training is always to kind of contextualize things. So I'm probably not the best person to ask, but that's what, you know, that's why I always reach for that kind of contextualization to think through, you know, how much of an impact has this had? You know, what are the other variables involved? And so I'm a little bit suspicious of people who don't do that work to actually kind of contextualize things, right? I'm always a little bit suspicious of the arguments mobilized where they're not actually trying to test their own limits, right, of their arguments. Yeah, from like a public policy, I guess, kind of view.
In terms of the participation rates, is that definitely clear that around the time of the, is it 1992 in Victoria or something, that people did start riding, whether it was due to helmets or not, around that time, was there definitely a decline?
Most evidence seems to indicate that. Again, definitely, it's hard to, we don't have a, like now we have a pretty robust way of measuring kind of cycling kind of participation rates, in particular around Melbourne. So that what they've done is they've embedded sensors all around Melbourne, right? So it's actually great for measuring actual rates of, the actual numbers of cyclists every day, like, which is, you know, in terms of the best possible way to get evidence around how many people are cycling. Unless you actually do literally have a sensor for every cyclist, you're not going to get much better evidence, like a way of measuring rates for an entire population. Yeah, so it's always a question of like sampling, who's been sampled, who's been asked. The big national cycling surveys from the 2000s and 2010s always had a sample, and it's like, well, is this a kind of robust sample? Really, you know, I'm part of a big kind of national survey around people who read news through digital channels, right, every year, and it's just kind of, we have a hell of a time trying to make sure that that is a kind of robust sample, and each year we tweak it a bit. So can you actually compare the different years, like if it's a slightly different sample, all these things? Yeah, it does raise all these questions. For me, it always is a question of context, though. Like, are the people making these arguments, have they explored the kind of internal kind of coherence of their own arguments? Have they thought through all the different possible variables that could be in play for which they need to test their own arguments? So most of the stuff I see doesn't do that. Like it does, like there's some pretty strong evidence in terms of being able to infer like a shift and then making an argument. But, you know, in terms of a slam dunk, no, I don't think there is that kind of slam dunk type argument that exists for this.
Thanks, Glenn.
That's that question.
At that point, I think I see so many hands there with burning questions, but it is 11 o'clock and Glenn has other work to do. So we do have to let him go at this point. So can please everyone thank Glenn enormously for joining us here this morning.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks heaps, Glenn. That was
Can I
fantastic.
just leave? I'm just going to leave.
You can just leave.
Okay.
Everyone,
Good luck, everyone.
you take.
Get out there on your bikes.
Yeah, get on your bikes. Take, how long? Do you want 10 minutes or do you want more than 10 minutes? Do you want, how long does it take to make a coffee? Take 10 minutes and then we'll come back and digest and explore and we'll go through the questions that you didn't get to ask and I'll see if I can dive in there and comment. So come back at 11 past and we'll get going again.
I'll just give a bit of feedback now or before we get back into the main thing. Ah, you're on mute. You're on mute, you're on mute, you're on mute.
I'm not there. I'm unmuted.
There we go.
There we go. I was talking to you. You weren't hearing me. I had to put my earphones in.
I knew what you're saying. That was all good.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. Having Glenn come in was really good. So thank you for that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I did sort of disclose I'm a cyclist and all that sort of stuff. But it was good to sort of have his perspective of the reporting of it and the way people sort of can frame things in terms of a bit of a victim blaming thing. And he mentioned sort of the going into the comments sort of thing, and you never go into the comments. It's not really that healthy, but yeah, that was good.
Look, I think as we'll come to in a second, and in fact we'll start again in 2 seconds properly. But it is really interesting to pull apart these ideas where evidence is a key part of what's going on here, but there are also a whole bunch of other things that we do need to unpack. The path dependency of our cities, the geography of our cities, the fact that, it's taken path dependency, it's taken 200 years to build our cities. To rechange them in the ways that would be desired is going to take another 100 years. But then flipping into that, how does this manifest in forms of identity, forms of sociologically determined anger at the world? That those people suffering from road rage probably have a lot of things going on that are making their lives quite hard at the moment. There's other research around that says that every bit of time, I don't know how it's framed, I've got to find it, but time stress is literally has health consequences straight away. So being stuck in traffic will definitely lead to health outcomes straight away.
Yeah.
Anyway, now that everyone's back, we can join in. We can continue with this, Andrew. Anyway, now that everyone's back, what I wanted to do is a couple of things based on what Glenn has done there. This is not going to be a formally structured lecture or anything like that. What instead I want to do is, first of all, go through questions that you wanted to ask, but you didn't get a chance to ask Glenn, or you couldn't quite phrase it, and now you've thought of how to do it. And I'm not Glenn, but I can speculate, and we can see if we can answer these things together. So any burning questions that we didn't get to, we can sort of cover off there. Second thing, there's a bunch of different bits of what Glenn was raising that are very germane to the whole idea of the relationship between evidence and policy making. So I'm not going to do formal lecture on any of these things, but a few things that I want to pull out and I want to pick up on in terms of how we think about the whole class. So I'll just go with the order of your hands that are up there. Simon.
Yeah, Glenn was awesome. Thanks for organising that, Will. The first question that came to mind when this topic was brought up was my own personal experience with the fact that I always wore a helmet and that's never been a problem. But if I ever dropped that helmet, then it didn't occur to me that I need a new one. So I had the same helmet for like 15 years. So the question I had was like, this is something I tried to find evidence on, and it was hard to find. There were more questions about should you or shouldn't you. It was like some sort of discussion that forums would have. I just wanted to know whether that was like an issue to do with this. So not whether you're wearing it or not, just like, is it something that you're actually taking responsibility for, or are you just complying just to kind of not get a fine?
Okay. I think you've got a great example there of what is going on here is that we can never, in a policy sense, make sure people are actually following all of the rules in terms of the intent of the rules. Yeah. It's not possible. It's to go out and say, is every helmet that is being worn in Australia of Australian standard? Of course not. No, some have been dropped. There's definitely people not doing up the straps. There's a whole bunch of things. My helmet, is one of those illegal helmets that you're not allowed to have in Australia. All sorts of things like that. What government can do is it has intervention points. So the easiest intervention point here is requiring helmets. So police can easily check, is someone wearing a helmet or not? That's easy. Trickier to assess if they're of standard when you're just driving past. But then what we can do is say that every helmet that is sold has to be at a certain standard. So the government is able to intervene at a couple of points in the moment to check that we're getting something there. But you know, are we getting people to internalize those beliefs that we should have a helmet that is going to protect you? A little bit, but not 100%. You know, we're never going to get to that place of everyone fully internalizing all of that. But this goes to, you know, all governance requires people's consent. And it requires, you know, if people all of a sudden decided not to follow through on any sort of law, then there's not much that government could do. There's no way that government could go in and check everyone all the time or to follow up on things. It requires us to internalize those laws and continue to follow them through. And government can't work in a maximal sense of everyone being checked all the time. Government requires people to do things, but also to change their values to line up with those things as much as possible. So, classic example, seatbelts would be, we've changed everyone's value, so everyone just thinks, all right, seatbelts are sensible, reasonable, and easy, and they're already in my car, so I'll just do them. But when they were coming in 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, there was a moment where people are saying, oh, I don't want that. That's an impost on me. That's annoying. That's a hassle, blah, blah, blah. Those values have disappeared. There's no one around now that really rages in a values sense against the existence of seatbelts or putting on their seatbelt. There's probably some lazy people or idiots, but not very much anymore. So over that time, government has changed our values to say, okay, seatbelts are easy.
So can I just because it feels very interesting to me, that's that point. It's like you compare it to seatbelts, but seatbelts, you don't have to maintain them. Like assuming seatbelts last as long as you've got a car if you run it into the ground.
They can be suboptimal, but probably now they're so simple and robust that that you don't really have to maintain them.
Yeah, but but I suppose the point is like for me, it's I sort of thought if it is an issue that you should be responsible for the helmet you're wearing. I kind of thought, well, why hasn't it been invented that like helmets have to come with like this sort of technology or whatever, that if it drops, it kind of gets a mark on it like a cricket bat?
Look, that's not bad. I mean, a clear example of this is tires now. Car tires now come with much better indicators of when they're running out.
Yeah, indicator. That's right. Yeah.
And so yes, you know, that's a form of innovation. You could say, okay, can we? You know, if a helmet were to shatter once you dropped it, then all of a sudden it's not usable and instantly. That's why we have safety glass and things like that. That might solve a problem. It's kind of hard because it's like, okay, should we require this? Is there the technology to enable this? Is it worth investing both financial resources in solving a problem that way and also governmental resources to say, yes, we now require this? Yeah, that's a government has a limited amount of political capital they can spend to then say, all right, this is what we now need. We need helmets that shatter.
Yes, yeah. And that's kind of like, that was sort of, I'm thinking, is it pushing the policy too far to say you got to wear helmets and also you got to keep them well maintained?
I'm sure
you're just going to get pushed back and it's going to go against what you're actually trying to do.
Look, I'm sure the policy does say they have to be well maintained. I just think that is harder to intervene on. It's just, yeah. Rainer.
Very interesting discussion. The thing that interests me here is that if you think about helmets, it's like a public health measure we're talking about, right? And generally the same people who would normally really advocate for government to intervene and to mandate something, when it comes to bicycle helmet, that same cohort, if you want, that same group, which is basically my tribe, progressive people, if you want, that it seems to be very different. And I wonder why that is, because the same arguments we've made here about why helmets shouldn't be mandatory, you could do the same thing about, say, mandating things around food. You could say mandating something, it would be much better to promote everybody to, you know, educate themselves and eat better food and you know, improve the infrastructure rather than saying banning junk food advertising. So my question is, why is the bicycle helmets, why is that so different to other public health measures?
I don't think it's incredibly different to other public health measures, but I think all public health interventions have their own particularities. you know, they are idiosyncratic. There will be a difference between bike helmet laws, mandatory seat belts, the width of footpaths, fluoridation of the water, limits on where you can smoke. All of them affect people in different ways. There are some groups affected more, some groups affected less. Some groups will get the financial cost, some groups will get the personal freedom cost, and some groups will get the health benefit and other groups won't get the health benefit. None of them are simple. There's very few public health interventions that benefit everyone equally 100% of the time. And in fact, if there have been, they've mostly been done by now. So some of the things like clean water, there's no one who argues against clean water, although there may well have been people 150 years ago. Yeah, I think I've got some examples of that. But now we've all accepted, we pay $5 in our tax per year individually so that we can all have clean water. There may be people who said, I don't want to pay that, I'll get my own water. Well, there are people that actually reject fluoridation, of course. But in all public health measures, there are going to be, they will hit people in different ways and have different sorts of consequences. A good example of this, well, it's a kind of different example, is, and we've done this previously as a topic, but I'm not doing it this year because I couldn't find an expert on this topic, is the growth of e-cigarettes. And there is a debate between some people who say e-cigarettes are a great way to get people to stop smoking, as in smoking traditional cigarettes, and other people say, no, they're a gateway drug to people starting smoking, or they come with their own health consequences. Now, probably all three of those things can be true. All of them can be true. And so there's no simple way for us to say, okay, should we or shouldn't we? There's not going to be one piece of science that will allow us to say, yes, we did the study and it works out that we should make sure all people who want to quit smoking have e-cigarettes to change. In the same way, going back to bike helmet laws, we can entirely believe that mandatory bike helmet laws may have stopped some people from cycling. I believe that. I don't know. They may have had some impact on other cycling infrastructure as governments become lazy and don't put it in. Have they made cycling safer? I'm guaranteed that they have saved people's lives, 100%. So both of these things can be true and they pull in a different direction. And government can choose, okay, which one of those do we prioritize? But we don't know. It's a hard thing to work out the values here of which one is the best one to do. Michelle.
Hello. My question is probably a bit more rhetorical. Just, I'm really interested in like the gig economy and like, it seems like it's really related, like where and how people work to like then how people commute to work. And I was just thinking about, so with Uber and that, you get this whole fleet of bicycles, but then as a person who freelances and has like 7 jobs, commuting seems more difficult because I don't have a like home-based office with like shower facilities or anything because there's no point investing in your freelance subcontractors. So I was just thinking about the way that the changing nature of work might also be starting a shift in the way people commute, and especially in regard to bikes.
I'd say definitely, definitely. I mean, we've got, who knows what the nature of work will be after COVID, but there are certainly a lot of pressures moving towards gig economies, towards more precarious employment, towards less people having more jobs. At the same time, there's a lot of pressures in how governments are trying to reorganize cities to be more climate positive and more health conscious. But, we've got cities that are very hard to change. They take hundreds of years to actually change. So I'd say that governments can't solve all of the problems. But I guess what a government will need to do is look at what variety of interventions can we do that will help as many people as possible here. And those working in the gig economy, yeah, that's a tough one. It's a tough one to try and solve there. But what I would say probably is the way that government will think is, okay, that might be high hanging fruit. This how governments typically design public transport systems is they on one side they can say the main job of our public transport system is to flood people into the city for 9 a.m. and flood people home for 5 p.m. The other end of a public transport system can be to get people around who can't afford it, but they might be moving in very different directions at very different times of the day. So, you know, that's between one suburb over here where someone with a disability goes to their weekly clinic, going in very different directions. Very hard to maintain one public transport system that does both of those things really, really well. Same token, to go to your idea of having workers that go to very different places, it's harder and harder for governments to do that. You know, a public transport system that's oriented around getting everyone into the CBD looks very different from one that is equitable for where everyone needs to go during the day.
Yeah, something also about incentivizing companies that subcontract freelancers to like also be responsible for the investment in like those people in their cities. Anyway.
Well, I think not necessarily about freelancers, but there is a growing recognition amongst companies and employers that that pre-COVID they save on parking by promoting cycling infrastructure. So if they put in a shower, then they may have to spend less money for their employees on on parking. And similarly, they might also gain some other benefits in health benefits. So the interesting thing in all of this is the costs and benefits are really hard to map out through an entire economy. Some people will benefit in a variety of different ways. And I think that there has been a growing effort over the last few years for both companies and state governments and local governments to try and understand what the costs and benefits are of public transport, of car-driven transport, of cycling infrastructure. But the problem is, who pays for these things? You know, if the benefits go to one group of people, but the costs go to someone else, that's a really hard thing to organise.
Thanks.
Sarah.
Thank you. I was just asking a question because one of the reasons I didn't do this topic was because discussions of mandatory bike helmets and helmets in general seems really very different from my experience because I ride horses and it's pretty much common sense. If you want to do anything, you should really wear a helmet. And I know in my family it's you only get one head sort of mentality. And so I was wondering, because when Glenn was speaking, I don't think I found that there was a good reason to not wear a helmet. So I was wondering if there was, like, is there a reason to not wear one?
There are certainly people who argue for it, both here in Australia, and you get a lot of people in the very cycling heavy European cities who will say, why are we doing this? For a variety of reasons. So some of them might say helmets there is some evidence that helmets make you less safe because cars treat you as a bit more protected, so they don't veer around you as much. Don't know, perhaps. But there are other people, and this probably goes a lot with what Glenn was saying, who say we should be looking at other parts of the whole system. Once governments say mandatory helmets, we've made cycling safe. They haven't made cycling safe, but they've stopped a lot of people from cycling by not investing in the infrastructure that will make people more likely to ride. Flip it around to one of those really very pro-cycling cities like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, and they say, okay, if you invest infrastructure here, then you will get the same returns in terms of cycling safety as mandatory helmet laws, possibly way more cycling safety benefits, but then you get also the health benefits and you get the urban infrastructure benefits of having a city that is much more organized around cycling. So whilst they may say, I don't want to wear my helmet because of freedom, there might be some people saying that, or maybe helmets have a not quite perfect record on there. But I think there is something to be said for letting people ride in everyday clothes and not have to worry about that, and having a city organized around cycling as much as possible, and that will get those safety benefits. So yes, there are some people who say helmets en masse don't make us as much safer as we might think. But a lot of them will still say, oh, helmets are fine, we should wear helmets. But assuming that that is the solution to cycling safety is the danger point. I think that would be the key thing that Glen would say, and that a lot of people would say as well. Amelia.
I will. Yeah, thanks. So I guess my question kind of has a little bit to do with Sarah's one, but I was thinking about how one of the main arguments against mandatory helmet laws is that helmets don't protect anyone else from injury other than the wearer. You know, so there's an argument that they're only really causing a risk to themselves, whereas someone who's in a car is causing a danger to others, sort of thing. However, I guess my thought there is, you know, what is the typical impact legally, but also maybe psychologically speaking, on the counterparty in an accident? So let's say a driver who ends up killing an unhelmeted cyclist instead of a driver who ends up injuring a helmeted cyclist. And is that part of the fine considerations, why you might fine someone who doesn't wear a helmet, you know, $500 instead of something more like $70, because the not wearing a helmet is causing greater odds of a manslaughter or criminal charge on the driver?
Huh, that's a fascinating way of framing it. Look, it's certainly true. Driver hits unhelmeted cyclist, driver hits helmeted cyclist. I would say almost linearly, there is an increase in the likelihood of the unhelmeted cyclist dying. Now, of course, there is still a chance that both might die and still a chance that both might live. So it's not, you know, not one-to-one. Should we therefore make someone else change their behavior to lower the psychological or culpability consequences for someone else? I don't know if that in itself is a justification to force people to wear a helmet. I mean, in some senses, I could say, all right, that's a justification for no one driving on the road when I'm driving on the road, and that will make me not a danger to anyone else, or make it as safe as possible for me. We do have to share our public space. We do have to share the world to some extent. So yes, we could argue that. So I think, oh, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I mean, I think it's interesting how this idea of mandatory helmeting laws intersects with an idea of self-sovereignty. So, like, you shouldn't be able to, you know, someone should be able to make their own decision, especially when it's something that doesn't impact anyone else. But when you think about how you operate in society, if you live 1,000,000 miles from anyone else and you want to cycle around your property without a helmet, go ahead and do that. But I'm not sure if self-sovereignty really applies when you can't extract, or you can't, you know, extricate society from the individual.
I think absolutely. I mean, we have of course limited forms of self-sovereignty. We can get our haircut anywhere we want, but we can't. We're not legally allowed to take various forms of drugs. We're not legally allowed to. There's a bunch of things that we're limited from doing. Now, some of those are for our own benefit, and some of those are to stop the impacts of our behaviors on other people. Where does the public start? I don't know if there is an answer to this. I don't know if there is an answer. I mean, this is a question, I guess, that we pull in different trajectories to answer, and different people will answer in different ways. We'll say that society should allow should prioritize individual liberty a fair bit more. There are certainly people who would say that. There would be other people that say no. The moment we are in public, then we have standards that will affect, or behaviors that will affect, everyone else. So we should be more limited. This is the question. You know, if you were to ask a libertarian where they would sit on this, they'd say, well, it doesn't matter about the public health benefits. It just matters about your right to choose what you want, your individual self-sovereignty, your bodily autonomy, which, you know, this is why it comes up so interesting when we hear the you know, that cyclist that was killed and people blaming their clothes, you know, how do you feel about that? Wow, they were wearing the wrong clothes. Their clothes were too dark, you know, and that, as Glenn said, you know, that parallels directly with discourse of victim blaming in other sorts of situations. I mean, you know, as Sarah said, I wear a helmet when I go downhill mountain biking, and that's sensible. It's not even on the road, so it's not actually legally required. So this is on out in the bush, so not legally required, but I certainly do. And I think anyone that doesn't is an idiot. Would I make them do it? No, not at all. Belinda. It doesn't say you're muted, but your voice isn't coming through.
Hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I can? Okay. Might be internet connection. So I'm wondering about the reasons behind the political decision making around cycling infrastructure. So Will, you made a comment a little bit earlier about the laziness of I think of relying on helmets being mandatory and not going that step of putting in the hard infrastructure in cycling. And I'm wondering if it's an issue of laziness, or, I mean, we talked about this a bit before, and cost, or there was a point that Glenn made as well about the probably the vested interests. He mentioned that the Liberal Party particularly has you know, it gets funding or gets donations from companies that own toll roads. You know, to what degree is there, you know, that kind of slightly corrupt interest in political parties in the infrastructure of roads that's a disincentive for governments to, you know, to put more investment into hard infrastructure? And to what degree is it laziness, and to what degree is it just I don't know, no, don't care?
Yeah, okay, great question, and I think we can answer it without being pejorative. And no, you know, your words are fine. Laziness is potentially part of it. Corruption, potentially part of it, but we don't have to use those terms to understand why governments choose certain things. The most useful way of, the most easiest way to frame the ways that governments choose certain things that is fair to them and is true is probably about path dependency. Now, path dependency suggests that, yes, if we're at the beginning of building our cities, yeah, we've come to a brand new place in the world, we're like Sim City or something like that, then we have unlimited options about how we will design our cities. And so we can choose from all of the suite of options to look at things. However, no one is there. Even brand new cities are designing cities now, and there'll be new technology in 50 years' time. But most cities are 100 years old, 200 years old, 500 years old, potentially 1,000 or more years old. And there is only so much that you can do. And so while cities are like that, so too governments and infrastructure. We have a path dependency. We have a path dependency in our world that suggests that we've set things up in this way, and to change to a very different way of organizing our business model, organizing our society, requires a vastly bigger investment. So even if a great cycling city might cost $1 billion, you know, a great car city might cost $2 billion. So even if the costs might have been higher in the end, if we've already spent $1.5 billion on the car city, then it's far cheaper to get to, you know, spend that other $500 million than the $1 billion for the bike city. Path dependency just means that we all, as individuals and governments, societies, will be far more likely to keep going in the path that we're in and make small deviations rather than reevaluate entirely. And I think this is a great example for cities, because geographically our path is set. You know, no one's changing the shape of Sydney, no one's changing the shape of Canberra or the shape of Melbourne. They geographically are set in certain ways. But also we've invested in certain forms of roads, certain forms of service stations, all of those kinds of things that will take a long time to change. We don't just get to flip them up and redo them. Now we can make small changes, and gradually as you make small changes, all of a sudden you might get big changes. So a great example of path dependency being flipped is we all had landline phones 20 years ago. Suddenly a new technology comes along where we think, oh, okay, this is a better way, and it does so many other things that are an advantage to me that I'll get this, and then eventually I won't have a landline phone anymore. So I assume most of you don't have a landline phone. Some of you do, but in the next few years, it will become less and less common. So we aren't locked by a path, but we will continue on a path until there is suddenly a technology that pulls us in a very different direction. And so that moves away from saying it's lazy or it's corruption, but to say, okay, actually, it's really hard to make vast changes that are required in different cities or in different ways of organizing our societies. Patricia.
Hi. More than a question regarding whether bike helmets should be mandatory or not. The thing that really surprises me during the research for this opinion piece was the very poor quality of the research that is done in the topic. And as a science communicator, I think that is actually something that we have not discussed enough. Yeah. That is like, how can we support any part of it, like saying in favor or against, when the science behind it is so bad. Like I cannot say as a science communicator, yeah, that is the right thing. I can do my opinion as a citizen, yep, but it will not be informed on the science.
Look, and one thing you can do here, it is very legitimate in your opinion piece or in a wider opinion piece, if you were to go out in society and argue on this topic, to say, we actually don't know enough about how bike helmets or mandatory bike helmet laws affect us. We do need more evidence. And I think that's, and we need better evidence. You know, I would definitely say that a variety of pieces of evidence in here are pretty slippery. They're pretty, you know, some of the studies like, oh, cars don't veer as wide around people when they have the bike helmet. You know, people cite that a fair bit in this space, but it's really pretty dodgy. So yes.
But I also think that one of the main things that surprises me is the very poor quality of the data that is collected by the government.
Yeah, yeah, yes. I agree with you, Patricia. The one thing I would say though is that this is not parachutes, but parachutes are the great example that in normal medicine, the gold standard is the double-blind randomized controlled trial. So group A gets a placebo, group B gets the intervention, and we test to see which one is more efficacious, and both the doctors and the patients are blind to which one is in, and we can work it out. That's great. But of course, we can't use that for all interventions in society. We can't use it for parachutes. We can't say, all right, you get parachutes that work, you get parachutes that don't work. Oh no, we won't tell them. We'll just give them half parachutes that work and half parachutes that don't, and see who survives. Because at some point we've got to say, all right, we can't do that test because ethically it would be terrible to kill all these people for that. But by the same token, if we have enough of a hunch that this is going to work, then we should do it anyway. So here's the question. What is enough of a hunch that mandatory bike helmets will save lives? I mean, you can ask a trauma specialist, you know, someone who works in an ER and they've seen brains after bad bike crashes. I'm sure they would say we have far more than enough evidence to say that putting something on your head will save lives. And let's get better and better versions of the things you put on your head will save lives. I don't think that evidence would be the hardest thing in the world to get. But then the bigger question is, okay, what about the other effects? What about all of the side effects of this law? You know, what does it do to cycling rates? What does then cycling rates do to cycling safety in general? What does it do to government likelihood to put in cycling infrastructure? What does it do to all of it? And those are really hard to pull through. You know, there's so many different, if we were to draw the flow chart of bike helmet laws to this, there's so many different pathways, so many different complex things interacting, so that it gets very hard to actually point to those things. All we can do, I'd say the best form of evidence we have here is to look at different cities around the world, assess them on a whole bunch of things. You know, geographically, what do they look like? Culturally, yes, but then also, what is their cycling infrastructure like? What are their mandatory bike helmets laws like? How spread apart they are, and how then can we assess both safety and the health benefits of these things? And that might be the best form of evidence we'll ever get. Ali.
Sorry. So basically, I was kind of going to ask about, you know, his expertise in talking about the media particularly. I was interested in, you know, I don't necessarily think that this debate is currently a hot topic right now. And I guess it's like, I was wondering what he thought the factors are that influence whether or not this is in the public sphere of debate.
I would say that I don't think it's a boiling hot topic at any time, but I think it's a topic that simmers along. Not necessarily the mandatory bike helmet laws, but I would say more broadly, Australian attitudes to cycling is a topic that continues to simmer and will continue to simmer because we are not great at sharing our public space with a variety of different users. I don't know if many countries are, but the more that you have dominant forms of users, cars in this instance, and rarer forms of other types of users, bikes or horse carts or something like that, people are not great at sharing. And I'd say that under there are weird forms of resentment, weird forms of hostility that linger in Australian society. Mandatory bike helmet laws might be part of that, but I think there is an ongoing hostility to cyclists. And though I think this manifests that you can see in victim blaming when clearly the victim is the cyclist who died. Even if there is you know, some culpability on there, I would say that Glen's research shows there is media hostility to cyclists in some parts of Australia, definitely, and there's probably a wider hostility to cyclists in Australian car drivers. Why that is the case? Not sharing, entitlement, something.
Perhaps people resistant to change, I suppose. I guess also touching on that, as science communicators or as people working in the media talking about science and things, how can we make this a newsworthy thing to talk about to kind of push governments and push research to happen in a more effective way? Because I guess when there's that public sentiment and people are really concerned about something and it is kind of that hot topic, there is more likely to be, you know, incentive for governments to look into it in a more effective way.
Great question. And I think there's two things to do. We should always seize the moment. So in a sense, we could have a seize the COVID moment and say, we're going to redesign our cities because we're going to be working very differently right now. One aspect of that is we may be more fearful of public transport into the future, but let's not all get back in our cars. Let's find ways to make our cities healthier and safer for cyclists. So there's a moment there to start talking about it. The other one I'd say is the other times when it boils up is when you have those horrific accidents. And I think here is where we say things like, don't victim blame. You know, they've been hit by a car. Let's think about, but also let's not blame, unless the car driver is literally a criminal. Let's not blame the car driver, and let's look for reasons why this occurs. You know, if a lot of crashes happen at one part of the road, we don't blame the drivers, we blame the road engineers. But beyond that, if we have a lot of crashes between interactions between different sorts of road users, let's not blame those road users. Let's set up our infrastructure so that it is better prepared for all of these different sorts of groups of people.
Thanks.
And then the evidence, you know, I think we need that evidence on, you know, it's from different parts of the world, but it's also on how do these interventions affect our daily lives and also our environment and also our health. You know, these are big ticket items. How are we all healthier because of different sorts of infrastructure, or all better environmentally because of different types of infrastructure? Manuela.
I think you just answered my question actually about
Yeah, I guess I was curious, like as science communicators, how do we frame the problem in order to, you know, calm this rate from among car drivers? We say that, you know, they might be frustrated for a million things. It's not, you know, anger towards the cyclist necessarily, but I think that, you know, if for policymakers to start making any change, even small, there needs to be public interest. So if the majority of the people don't care about cyclists, they just want to drive and they just want bigger roads for their cars, like why would policymaker be motivated to make any change? So I guess as a, you know, as a communicator, I'm thinking, well, how can I convince people, well, drivers, that actually having more cyclists and less drivers will be beneficial for everyone?
This is the one I love, because if you love driving, then you actually want other people on the road to catch the bus or to get on their bike and ride in a bike lane, because suddenly, you know, there's 2, 3, 4, 5 people less on the road in terms of a car. You know, there's more room for you. So for car drivers, there is actually solid reasons why you would want other people using other sorts of infrastructure. So while, you know, the standard, the huge fallacy of the mid part of the 20th century was, if you have traffic congestion, you build more roads. You build more roads. I mean, that didn't solve the problem. You know, suddenly we just get more drivers and it fills up that space. But I think there is a really legitimate argument that, you know, no problem here with having car drivers. I think they're a valuable part of infrastructure, and they're certainly something that, you know, some people will never be able to get around any other way. Absolutely. And they're, you know, a key part of how we move things around. But that doesn't mean that everyone should be driving. I think that's one of the dangerous points here, is where we think, oh, that's the only way of getting around, the only way of setting up our system. But to bring it back to what will make policymakers care is when we think about those bottom lines. And the bottom lines are, they have to move people around the city for the cheapest rate possible. You know, they want to, how fast can we move people around per $1 billion or something like that. Secondly is the environmental benefits and the health benefits. And they need to look at those and say, okay, if we promote better cycling infrastructure, does that get people to move around our city faster? Probably, by taking some cars off the road. Some drivers are getting there faster, you know, those kinds of things. Does it promote better health consequences? Yes, and that has direct budgetary impact. Does it promote better environmental impact? Yes, it does. Now, that would have a better environmental impact if we had, or a calculable thing on their budget with a carbon price. We don't quite have that, but they would be able to see those three things.
Thanks.
One thing I just want to touch on finally, because there's a bunch of things that Glenn pulled out there that you may have noticed. You know, standards versus innovation early on. You know, what about bike helmets and how we can innovate in different regimes, but not if we have hyper government standards. The habits that lead to different behaviors, what causes them, but what contributes to them, not thinking about one moment, but about all sorts of different things in the system. But the one that I want to pull in on is this argument that we need more evidence. And it's an important thing in science that we always should be looking for better evidence for how to understand what is going on in a different scenario. It's a key part of science. You know, you do a research paper and it'll say, you get to the end and say, okay, what are my limitations and what is future research? Here's what we couldn't find out. Here's what should come next. Key part of science. But when do we have enough evidence to act? I think we can go back to climate change here. You know, we can say, oh, we need more evidence. We need more certainty to act on this. But surely at some point, do we have enough evidence to act? I think the interesting thing here is you do get people in the saying, oh, we need more research on how to make renewable power more efficient, more whatever. I say, look, you know, yes, there could be better. We could have better solar panels. We could have better wind farms, whatever. Do we have enough now to be better? Probably. Do we have enough evidence to move our cities in some sorts of directions? Probably. We don't have the perfect evidence of, okay, what is the best way to do all of this? But having enough evidence to act is not the same as having all of the evidence. Sean?
Yeah, just on that thing of not having enough evidence, because I've seen a couple of things suggesting that it's only in the using of stuff that we actually start to make things more efficient. And so people sort of point to the increased efficiency of nuclear power, for instance, up until Chernobyl happened. And at that point, everybody stopped doing nuclear power plants. And the research around that just diminished. And so, you know, at some point, there's an argument to be made to, okay, we've got to bite the bullet and take a step, because that's where free market capitalism will start improving upon current design.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think on that, we have to recognize where we are. You know, we might be able to scientifically design a world where we can solve every problem or have the most efficient form of transport or energy or whatever it is, but we're not there, and we never will be. We have to live in worlds where we are, that have cultures, that have geographies, that have infrastructure that has been set up. Our job as science communicators is to try and think, okay, how do we move our world to a place that is better scientifically according to our values? Now, at this point, I'll say values might be better health outcomes, better environmental outcomes, better social outcomes. Okay, but what are the forms of evidence that will take us there? And what are the forms of choices that will take us there? Because there's a whole bunch of them, and there's not going to be one pathway. And I think in this comes to the final point here, that there will be so many forms of evidence that are useful to understand something as simple as bike helmet laws. There's so many different pieces of evidence that will help us to understand, should we, shouldn't we, how should we do this? Our choice as societies is what bits of evidence we use, and will help to get us to the place where we want to be. All right. Email me throughout the week if you have any questions on your opinion pieces. I will have, actually it's for a different class. Oh, for the web class. I'll be there for the drop-in tutorial on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock or Friday at 12 o'clock. So join in then if you have any questions. Then you can just hijack it. Otherwise, shoot me an email if you have questions. Otherwise, go do some writing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Will. Bye. Bye.